This video is sponsored by Movie Palette. Hello and welcome to Projector at the London Film Festival, and on this episode, Brendan Fraser confronts his mortality in Darren Aronofsky's The Whale. After the death of his boyfriend Alan, English teacher Charlie, played by Brendan Fraser, has become a recluse, hiding inside his apartment and teaching classes remotely, and his eating disorder has accelerated in his grief, now weighing around 600 pounds. Charlie suffers a heart attack, and despite the pleas of his nurse Liz, played by Hong Chow, he refuses to go to the hospital, even though his heart will fail in days if untreated. Charlie becomes determined to try and fix his relationship with his estranged daughter Ellie, played by Sadie Sink, in what time he has left. The Whale is based on Samuel D. Hunter's 2012 play of the same name. He also adapts a screenplay for this film version, and the movie is directed by Darren Aronofsky of Requiem for a Dream and Black Swan. This is his first movie in 5 years after the incredibly polarising Jennifer Lawrence movie Mother, and believe me, The Whale is set to be no less divisive. Even before the movie came out, there were numerous think pieces about the subject matter and Fraser's casting it, and certainly those were important debates to be had, but the actual sensitivity of those articles varied all over the place, and I can definitely see audiences having mixed responses to the movie. But there is one thing that can be universally agreed upon, and that's Brendan Fraser is absolutely phenomenal in the movie. In fact, that's pretty much been A24's marketing in a nutshell, literally off the back of word of mouth about Fraser's performance, while revealing as little about the movie as possible. Up until very recently, there was very few bits of footage or stills released from the movie. Now the film is in semi-limited release in the US, they have released a little bit more footage, but even so, A24 have very deliberately been keeping the film very close to the chest and largely letting Fraser's performance speak for the entire movie itself. And I do have to say that that is a very wise marketing trick, because the rest of the film will certainly depend on what you bring to it. It's a movie that I have personally been very conflicted about ever since I saw it, and that was almost 2 months ago now. But as I said, it's very hard not to root for the movie purely on the basis of Fraser himself, who was one of the most likeable leading men of the 90s and the noughties. Certainly Fraser was blessed with a combination of classic matinee idol good looks and a self-effacing screen presence. This was someone that was not afraid to send himself up. In fact, it almost seemed like he relished in getting to be goofy, and that meant they almost effortlessly transitioned out of roles like Encino Man and George of the Jungle into being an action hero in an Indiana Jones style series like the Mummy franchise. But what he brought to that role was a wit and sensitivity that's unusual for an action hero and set him apart from so many others. He met the tongue-in-cheek tone of those movies, but as many Fraser heads will also point out, he's been doing strong dramatic work for quite some time now, and they'll point you towards movies like Gods and Monsters or The Quiet American, where Fraser kept up with the likes of Ian McKellen and Michael Caine. So Fraser is definitely a strong talent that for a long time has actually been quite underrated, and certainly over the last decade, which have definitely been wilderness years for Fraser, he has been sorely missed. The Whale is the first time he's had a leading role in over a decade, and it's a part that reminds you not only of just how talented and just how good Fraser is, it might be the best performance that he has ever given in anything. When Fraser talks as Charlie, speaking about the empathy of human beings and how it's almost impossible for them to not care, it feels like Fraser is speaking those words from the very bottom of his heart. What he brings to the role of Charlie is his innate warmth just coming as part of his screen persona, and given all that he's gone through over the last few years, it feels like he's put every bit of pain, every bit of hurt, every bit of rejection, and put it into this character. It is a remarkably vulnerable performance. Fraser puts himself completely out on display in this movie, and it's just extraordinary work. It feels like a lot of the time the role blurs between Fraser the actor and Charlie the character. Fraser's Charlie is intelligent, witty, thoughtful, and sensitive, all of these things that you can name before his eating disorder. What Fraser brings to the role simply is empathy. The Whale is meant to be an exercise in that, and I feel that Fraser understands that perhaps sometimes even more than the movie itself does. When the film falters, it's usually the power of Fraser's performance that gets it right back on track. Fraser is so empathetic towards Charlie, you can feel it in his every mannerism on screen, but also because Charlie is an embodiment of that. He sees the best in other people, even when they don't see it in themselves. He can see what their potential is. He is so generous and so kind, sometimes to a fault. And the tragedy of the character is that he has so much time for other people and so much sympathy that he simply does not offer to himself. The problem is that ever since Charlie lost his lover, that was the point where something completely broke in him. As he explains, he has always been a big man, but then his eating disorder spiraled out of control, and there is a deep well of self-hatred inside of him. Charlie has never forgiven himself for anything, certainly not the dissolution of his marriage and the estrangement from his daughter that came with that. He carries that shame with him every single day, and he's just totally shut himself off from the rest of the world in his grief. He teaches his classes entirely by video call, but with the webcam turned off. He lies about being broken, but really it's because he believes that his appearance will shock his students, that he is fundamentally unlovable. And then, when he realises his time is running out, he feels like he has to atone and correct his mistakes in some way while he's still around. And so, in that way, Fraser's performance is powerfully affecting. It's very hard to watch the movie and not find yourself getting emotional at the depths that Fraser manages to find in his performance. I believe that it really is genuinely his finest hour in terms of acting. But Fraser isn't the only strong performance in the movie. Hong Chow is particularly good as Charlie's friend slash nurse slash enabler Liz, who offers some advice to Charlie, specifically go to the hospital, but she also adds some humour to the film, some welcome respite from the otherwise grim tone of the movie. The character largely functions as comic relief because she's rather blunt in her advice, but she does care for Charlie, especially later in the movie. I think that Chow is particularly heartbreaking, and I think the scenes that she shares with Fraser are among some of the film's strongest. Speaking of that, Samantha Morton is also very good in a much smaller role as Charlie's ex-wife. She pops up about an hour into the movie, and she doesn't stick around for too long, but she does have a key pivotal scene which is phenomenally well acted before exiting right out of the movie again. In fact, that seems to be her MO at the London Film Festival, because she does the same thing in She Said. However, this is where I start to get into my problems with The Whale, beginning with the fact that it is extremely theatrical. Now, this in of itself isn't necessarily a problem. I mean, obviously it's based on a stage play, it's going to have that quality inherent to it, especially one that is set entirely in one location. In this case, Charlie's apartment, which we're in from beginning to end. The only time that we step out of it is literally onto the front door. and that's about it. And I do think that Aronofsky does combat this with his direction. The way that he stages and shoots the movie, the set never becomes uninteresting, particularly because of the use of the lighting. The film is very dark and gloomy. There is a deliberately oppressive feel about the film, especially because the movie is shot in 4:3, which evokes a kind of proscenium arch theatre stage, but also deliberately makes Charlie emphasised in the frame because of his size. And so in that way, I think that there is actually kind of a cinematic quality to the way that Aronofsky shoots this, even though it's set entirely in one location. What I mean by this largely comes down to the script. As I mentioned, Samuel D. Hunter adapted his own stage play to the screen, and any additions to the film version are extremely minimal. Largely, this is a very faithful one-to-one translation of exactly what it was like on the stage. But I feel like this kind of exemplifies a crucial difference between the two mediums. Theatre obviously has to deal with the inherent limitation of having to put everything out on stage in front of a live audience, and therefore a certain level of abstraction is expected. So characters might not necessarily be real people, they might be stand-ins for other concepts. Whereas film is inherently more naturalistic. It inherently evokes the feeling that these are real people. And obviously, this is not a strict rule by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like there is a subtle difference there that The Whale in its film adaptation illuminates, because I feel like a lot of the time the writing in The Whale feels a bit overcooked, at least when it's done on film. Everything feels a little bit too neat, a little bit too constructed. A good example of this is the fact that nearly all the characters in the movie are connected in some way, even if they seemingly aren't at first glance. They'll have some deeper connection to what's going on. The most glaring example of this is Ty Simpkins' missionary character, who pops up at the beginning of the movie and then just sticks around for long chunks of it. His character basically exists largely as a sounding board for other characters, be it Charlie, Liz, or Ellie, when others are otherwise absent or indisposed. He is there for them to deliver exposition to, and when that isn't the case, he's largely a vessel for the film's debates about religion. Again, a key theme in Aronofsky's work. You can tell why he was attracted to this project, given those themes in previous films like Mother and Noah, and again, it's very prominent in The Whale. The character is part of this Christian sect, and he's trying to convert Charlie, especially because he's very aware of his situation and his impending death, so he is offering him salvation in his final days by embracing God, even though Liz tells him directly that is not the kind of closure that Charlie is after. But the character just hangs around like a lost puppy, and there is a larger purpose to this character, but for the most part, he feels like a construct. He never feels like an actual person, and again, on the stage, you can kind of forgive the artificiality, but on film, the faults of this play become more glaringly apparent because it simply does not seem real. This character would not hang around in the way that he does. It doesn't help that character's entrance into the movie sets it off on a bad note. The first time that we physically see Charlie in the movie, he is, gratifying himself, shall we say, when the missionary comes in through the door, stumbles in on him, and triggers the plot-instigating heart attack. And that is a scene that genuinely made me wonder what the intent of the work was, because if this is meant to be a plea for empathy, like it so often states, particularly from Charlie, why is it so shrouded in cynicism and darkness? If you were trying to make Charlie sympathetic to the audience, why start with a shock scene like this one? This works on the assumption that the audience is meant to be surprised that someone like Charlie is engaging in an action like this, and in some level is meant to be repulsed by it. I don't know, maybe I'm misreading this in some way, but there are several moments in the film where the character of Charlie is framed in a way where it is amplifying, his size and his stature in a way that I would argue is maybe a little bit distasteful, or maybe even forgetting the empathy that so purportedly is trying to promote. And it isn't helped by the fact that so often the characters are yelling at Charlie. It is a surprisingly not just talky movie, but shouty movie. Everyone is telling Charlie how terrible and awful and worthless he is. In fact, they are saying it in the most brutal ways. On a fundamental message level, the movie confuses cruelty with honesty. Honesty is something the movie keeps coming back to as a theme. Over the course of the movie, Charlie keeps reciting an essay that he read about Moby Dick years ago, and he's got it recited verbatim. At moments of extreme anxiety for him, he starts quoting it as a way of trying to comfort himself, and the essay is actually quite scathingly critical of Moby Dick. The author is using it to distract us from his pain. Very kind of heavy-handed in its allegory there, but even so, we come back to this idea several times over the course of The Whale, because Charlie, as a teacher, is trying to promote honesty in his students. When he is at his very lowest ebb, he writes an extremely unprofessional email that he sends out to all of his students, which basically goes along the lines of, "Write me something honest." And it seems to me that the movie confuses that kind of just brutal nastiness with honesty, with actually clearing the air in some way, instead of just simply reciting platitudes. And maybe there is a thought to that, but I often found that it ran very contrary to the film's message of empathy overall. It feels like it butts against it at several points. Embodying this further is the character of Ellie. The estranged father-daughter dynamic at the centre of The Whale very much evokes Aronofsky's earlier movie, The Wrestler, especially given that both father figures have faulty tickers they're about to stop at any moment, and that realisation of their mortality triggers this attempt to try and reconnect with their estranged offspring, and both relationships are similarly caustic. Ellie is extremely angry and resentful at Charlie for leaving their family behind, and she has all of these feelings that she just lashes out at Charlie with, although she pretty much lashes out at anyone in her general vicinity. And I want to stress that Sadie Sink is a very talented young performer with a bright future ahead of her, and clearly she went after this role with gusto, with the same level of intensity as Fraser. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it's a pretty terrible part, leaving aside from the fact that at times the dialogue reminds you that this was very much written in 2012 at times, with no attempt to try and update it in any real way. The character is deliberately meant to be initially unsympathetic, because she is meant to test the audience's sympathy. She is someone that even her own mother basically calls a demon that she cannot control. She is posting dead photos of animals on her Facebook page, or taking photos without permission of other people and putting them on her page and writing these diatribes about them. And Charlie, being her father, is looking for the bright side, basically chalking it up to teenage rebellion, which I feel like this goes well beyond the accepted limits of. I mean, there's teenage rule breaking, and then there's the stuff that Ellie does in this movie. The character is so acidic and so spiteful that I had a hard time sympathising with her, despite Sink's very best efforts. efforts, and as a result, this actually brings down a lot of the drama. Later in the movie, there is a key choice by Ellie that comes back into the ending with unintended consequences, and this could be read in several ways because it's meant to be ambiguous, but the movie is clearly pushing you towards Charlie's reading of it, that actually this surliness is a facade, that deep down Ellie does actually care, even when she protests that she doesn't. The problem, of course, is that you could totally read it the other way around, that actually this was an accident, and really this was out of maliciousness, and because I wasn't feeling particularly warm to this character, that's exactly how I chose to read it. So again, going back to this idea of empathy, yes, we should, but that doesn't mean unlimited empathy or unlimited forgiveness. And then we get back to Aronofsky's direction, who, let's be honest, has never knowingly underplayed his melodrama if he can help it. Subtlety is not his style. And maybe The Whale should have been with someone whose priority was that. It felt like to me, at times, Aronofsky was grabbing me by the collar and basically going, "You're going to cry at this movie," especially with the use of the film's soundtrack. The score by Rob Simonson is very present, particularly in the film's big emotional moments. It is so loud at times, I found it quite distracting. It felt like it was just basically telling me to feel sad and be moved at everything that's happening on screen. At times almost threatening to overwhelm the performances, almost like the actors are having to yell past it. I felt like, in general, a lot of the sound mix was like this. In fact, the two kind of go in combination in a sequence where Charlie starts binge eating at a moment of absolute desperation and sadness, and again, Aronofsky really wants to make you feel affected by making sure that it's shot in the most gross manner possible, like it's something out of Requiem for a Dream, and making sure that you can hear all the chewing and mastication that's going on as Charlie consumes this food and then vomits it back up again. And again, it's one of those sequences that made me wonder, was this really the right team to actually handle this? Again, are we actually handling this with sensitivity? And I'm not sure if I could totally answer yes on that count. However, I won't deny the fact that at the very end of this movie, I definitely did cry. In fact, lots of people cried in that press screening, because honestly, you'd have to have a pretty hard heart to not be moved by the final movements of this movie. The problem, in my opinion, is that the movie not only strains way too hard to do that, but I was also very keenly aware of the fact that I was being very much manipulated to feel that way. Is Brendan Fraser going to dominate the awards season this year? Absolutely, and he deserves it, in all honesty. His performance in this movie is magnificent. The question is, would the movie work without Brendan Fraser? And I'm not sure if it does. I feel like Fraser so embodies the empathy that it's trying to promote that to some degree he does overcome the issues with the tone, script, and direction. If anything, this film adaptation is a missed opportunity to update the stage play. It feels like it's still locked into about 10 years ago, particularly with the way that it addresses weight, which is not always the most sensitive, and I do think that is going to polarize audiences. The debate around the film is likely not to be settled anytime soon. I think the real question, ultimately, is not whether Brendan Fraser deserves awards, but whether The Whale deserves Brendan Fraser, and the jury is very much still out on that. And I'm kind of leaning towards the negative. You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FILMBRAIN15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or alternatively you can join my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share and subscribe. Those all help as well. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.